Welcome to the Leading at the Next Level podcast with Dove Development and Consulting, the show built to provide ongoing support for your leadership journey. Before we move into today's lesson, let's make sure that we're on the same page. We've seen firsthand how much more is required to provide authentic leadership to a team than to simply manage based on the authority that comes with a title or a position. What we've learned through more than 50 combined years of leadership responsibility is that taking the extra steps to serve people and really earn influence will always produce results that barking orders never will. If you'll stick with us to the end of this episode, we'll share how you can get a complimentary trial to a resource that we've built to support you in that process that's like nothing else you've ever seen. With that in mind, let's close the look at the cost of confusion by digging into how leaders can take the time to really set clear expectations in the teams. If we really want to have a shot at capturing that profitability that I feel like is killed so often by confusion, and that confusion again is by not having clear expectations throughout the organizations, and by providing the teams with the clear expectations they really need to produce great results, it's going to require a very focused effort on anybody's part that's in a leadership role. We absolutely must become experts in providing our team as a whole, as well as each individual who's part of the team, with extreme clarity as to the results that we need from them, as well as the behaviors we expect from them in order to achieve those results. Talking about the results alone is good, but we better be specific about the behaviors as well. Now, in attempting to do that, though, I've seen a number of leaders all too often shy away from setting the bar too high, so to speak. Their concern in those cases, it seems to be, if the expectations are set too high, people will shy away. Oh, I just can't make it, and so on. Now, as we've worked through these profitability killers, I've referenced several lessons that I learned in the 15 years or so that I was directly involved in what became a really successful behavior-based safety process. Now, at the risk of kind of beating that horse clear to death yet again, I'm going to share another one. This time, though, the lesson came really from two of my mentors in that process rather than the science that the process was based on. So the first piece of that lesson, it came, I think, probably in May 98 or 99, during my really initial training to perform just the behavior-based observations on my coworkers throughout the facility. And most of that 2-day training session was given by one gentleman that was responsible for overseeing the initiative at our location. But one of the segments was done by the then maintenance supervisor. His name was Terry, and his piece was really geared at detailing how our behaviors are always determined by the consequences that come from them, but learning to recognize certain things that trigger those behaviors served as a really effective way to predict those behaviors in advance. Now, I can't go into everything that he shared in that 90-minute lesson here with you, but one thing that he always emphasized was a core tenet he had learned in his time at the United States military at West Point. He said it was really the importance of choosing the harder right over the easier wrong, and how that always produced better results over the long haul. Now, here's where you're probably wondering, gosh, Wes, how does that tie to eliminating confusion by setting clear expectations? So by itself, Terry's story made a solid case for how choosing a behavior that was easier but also riskier in the moment would inevitably result in an injury when it was repeated over time, over and over again. And statistically, if we're looking at machine cycles and so on, we could say, okay, within X number of years, here's when it's going to happen. Not if, but when it's going to happen. Now, what he went on to explain was how taking that extra step to reduce the risk might require some additional effort right away, but how it would pay huge dividends long term by eliminating the potential for injury and thereby some costs and so on and so forth. So pretty cool lesson, harder right over the easier wrong. The second part of that lesson ties back to something I learned from an old chap from across the pond. Dave Stanley was his name, and he was one of the folks that was charged with the initial implementation in the process. And probably a year or so before I met Terry, It was, I think, 15 or so at the time. And by the time I met him in 2002 or three, somewhere in there, he was kind of last man standing from that initial group of implementation folks. And he had global responsibility for that process. Now, for the whole company. Now, his home, he was from South Wales, United Kingdom. He traveled all over the world providing training at each of the 75 or 80 facilities the organization had at that time. Now, in his first visit here to Harrisonburg, Virginia, he explained that the difficulty of a task and the compensation involved rarely served as the primary reason somebody would choose not to perform it. And Dave went on to share that the biggest reasons for avoiding any task was really not seeing value in performing it. He challenged us all to consider the folks that we knew who risked their lives in, say, the military or first responders, law enforcement, for little and in some cases no pay as volunteers to do things that were incredibly hard and took a ton of effort and so on and so forth. As it related to safety, his message was that when we provide clarity as to how specific behaviors would eliminate injuries and why that mattered, would be critical if we wanted to build and maintain a successful process. Now, if we're going to tie that to Terry's idea of the harder right over the easy wrong, I think that's where, as leaders, it really comes into the picture with how we help our teams produce great results by making sure that they've got extremely clear and high expectations. Now, as I shared from the Tony Geary, the fellow that wrote that article I referenced before, it's hard to sell mediocrity. So why would we even bother? We absolutely should be challenging our teams to exceed expectations on a daily basis, but we also have to make sure we're giving them the clarity that they need to understand exactly what it looks like, how they can achieve it, and why it matters to them individually as well as to the organization as a whole. Now, doing this can be difficult, so let's wrap this up. Let's take a quick look at a few very simple steps that we can take to make sure this happens in the organizations or the areas that we're responsible for leading. As we looked at all the profitability that's, say, killed through poor communication, back in that lesson, I suggested that, gosh, in some cases, breaking the golden rule just may be an approach that makes a positive impact. Now, if you're not tracking with me on that, I'd challenge you to go back and revisit the idea. But assuming that it's still relatively fresh in your mind, because I've touched on it there and in several other lessons, let's push forward. And let's really dig into a few of the specific things that we can do to set extremely clear and high expectations to really produce great results that our organizations need to thrive and move away from that pack that we looked at. So in looking for resources that offered some insight on this to support hands-on experiences that I've had personally, I found an article that was called Cultivating a Culture of Clear Expectations and Accountability That Equips and Empowers. It was from a group called CU Insight. Apparently that's a peer group for credit unions, and it shared this. It said, leaders are ultimately responsible for setting expectations, effectively communicating those expectations, and developing accountability standards. Not only are leaders responsible for setting clear expectations, but those expectations must be realistic. Metaphorically speaking, unrealistic expectations are equivalent to running on a hamster's wheel, going nowhere fast. This parallel is valid for workplaces where employees with no expectations and accountability are completing repetitive and unfulfilling tasks that produce zero to minimal growth. This type of behavior leads to disengagement and is toxic to any organization. So the next profitability killer that I'll be addressing here in these lessons is accountability. So I'm going to skip that part for now. But let's look specifically at setting expectations and effectively communicating those expectations, as well as the piece emphasizing that those expectations must be realistic. Now, far too often, I've seen folks in leadership roles, again, be reluctant to communicate expectations that could be even perceived by their teams as too high out of concern of seeming unrealistic. And I suppose I can understand that, but I'll challenge you to not write something off as unachievable simply because the bar seems to be set high, right? I mean, we can do things often that we're not even certain we can do if we just push a little bit harder. Now, if we work to effectively break that golden rule that we talked about before with each individual on our teams, and we can provide them with the style of communication that they need to clearly understand our expectations, say for the action we need them to take, as well as the results that we need them to achieve, we should really have a solid foundation in place for that. And when it comes to setting expectations that are high, but still realistic, I'm convinced that it really comes down to tying them to a purpose that tugs kind of the heartstrings of those team members. And again, let's take it back to their communication style, their needs, and so on. When we understand that, we can do that. And with improving employee engagement, having a purpose that means something to each of us, and it makes an impact that's bigger than any one of us can earn. Any one of us, it can earn a level of effort and engagement, that discretionary effort, if you will, that's rarely given in an attempt to hit some moderate goal. I've never seen people give all they've got if it's something they feel like they can achieve easily. I'll say it once more, for instance, people don't shy away from work because they believe it's hard or because the pay's low. They shy away from things that they don't feel like has purpose, that they don't see purpose in. So, gosh, I truly believe that leaders who fail to set high expectations and communicate them clearly to their team, they are indeed creating that culture that can be toxic to the organization. But when we do those two simple things, I'm not stressing they're easy, I'm saying simple, we can remove all doubt about what is expected and why it matters. Then all we've got to do is to maintain those expectations consistently and across the board. So before we move on to accountability, let's kind of tie this all together by addressing that need for consistency, right? So here's what I can promise you. We can indeed eliminate that cost of confusion, and we can avoid leaving a ton of profit on the table if we're willing to provide that kind of the clear expectations that can produce results. Now, I'm certainly not suggesting, again, I'll stress this, that I don't think it's easy, but by following those few simple steps, we can really remove the doubt that often bogs so many team members down. But take note, this is absolutely not something that we can do once and hope to move on with our lives. As leaders, the key to keeping this profitability killer at bay is making sure that we provide extremely clear expectations that we've been looking at here. We've got to do it early, we've got to do it often, and really everywhere in between. Now, in a lesson that Cindy and I share pretty frequently now, that called Building Buy-in around a clear mission and vision. It was something we had initially developed for Executive Leadership Elite Think Tank, but now we provide it routinely as keynotes for various organizations. We share something that we learned, gosh, 20 plus years ago from John Maxwell in the 21 Irrefutable Laws of Leadership, where he describes the law of the picture. And John says that the temptation for any leader is to merely communicate about the vision. Now, I'm convinced that this applies at least as much to expectations, because those are usually less flashy than a leader's vision or a vision statement of an organization. John goes on to warn that the challenge that comes with this, he says, vision has a tendency to leak. Now, quite frankly, high expectations, they leak too if we only talk about them occasionally. If we say, okay, here's our expectation, and we never circle back to it, we never clarify, we never repeat it. One thing that I've learned from all those years of behavior-based safety was that we all need boundaries. Our behaviors are driven by the consequences that we've come to expect from those behaviors, and those consequences are tied directly to whether or not we know exactly what's expected of us and whether or not we'll be held accountable for not performing within those expectations. I could go into so many different scenarios about why we're willing to take this risk or that risk, why we're willing to speed. I won't do that for you. To be sure, our team members, though, they've got a clear understanding of what we expect, as well as how they can exceed those expectations on a regular basis. We need to communicate those expectations with them in that language they can best receive, the platinum rule, if you will. We've got to be sure that we tie them to a purpose that that team member buys into. And then we've got to do it over and over and over again. We've got to keep that message in front of them. Make no mistake, though, just talking about it, gosh, that's never going to be enough. We better be sure that we provide them an example that they can follow. They need to be able to see us doing it. And we also need to commit to holding folks accountable when they miss the mark, or we're going to fall prey to a different profitability killer, and that accountability profitability killer is exactly what we're going to dig into in the next lesson I share in this platform with you.
Thanks for listening to the Leading at the Next Level podcast. If you'd like to go deeper into anything that we've shared here, or you need continuing education credits for your professional credential, send us an email at admin@dove-development.net, and we'd be happy to hook you up with a 45-day all-access trial to our complete Leading at the Next Level program. At no cost. That full program, it includes access to well over 100 hours of digital lessons, each of which are approved for credit in different entities. It comes with complete slides and action-based assessments for each of those lessons that really are geared at helping you capture measurable bottom line improvements in your organization, as well as 2 live lessons each month that close with Q&A, where we really try to help you identify the specific action that you can take to lead your team more effectively.